Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. Years ago, in a former life, I had a sign in my office. The sign said, "No whining zone." Basically, I wanted to hear what was on people's minds, but I didn't want to come in just to whine to me about things. Most of us know how irritating whining can be. One of the prophets in the Old Testament, probably the prophet that becomes the most real as you read his work, is the prophet Jeremiah. And he violated my sign a few times. Jeremiah is so brutally honest that he can complain to God about God. And we'll look at that in just a minute. Jeremiah is a young man when he's called. Jeremiah chapter 1 tells you that his excuse was for not answering God's call, or trying to not answer God's call, is in verse 6, "I'm only a youth." And God says in verse 7, "Don't say I'm only a youth, for to all to whom I send you, you shall go. Whatever I command you, you shall speak." In other words, this isn't optional. Go do it. I don't care how old you are. Doesn't make any difference. Jeremiah goes. He speaks whatever God tells him to speak. And as you might guess, most of it is focused on the people's sin, and the result that the consequence of their sin being that God will take the land away from them, that God will relocate them and move them to Babylon in captivity. The people have a false hope. They have a false hope because the temple of God is in Jerusalem. And they say, God lives here. God will not destroy this city. Jeremiah, you don't know what you're talking about. And they ridicule Jeremiah. One of the most famous parts of Jeremiah's book is Jeremiah chapter 7. And it starts out, "The word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, stand in the gate of Yahweh's house and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of Yahweh, all you men of Judah, who enter these gates to worship Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and I will let you dwell in this place." In other words, here's the deal. Turn back to me, quit worshiping the Baals, quit doing the stuff I told you not to do, turn back to me, and I'll let you live here. And then the next line, I love this, because you have to read this sort of like this. "Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is a temple of Yahweh. This is a temple of Yahweh. This is a temple of Yahweh." He says it 3 times, over and over, mocking. Don't trust in the fact that there's a building in your midst that has my name on it, because I'll wipe that building out too. He makes that point through the rest of that, what's called the temple sermon. He makes the point that that temple would one day be a pile of rubble also. Jeremiah uses a bunch of illustrations too. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are two that use what we call symbolic acts. Other prophets do too, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel use it the most. Jeremiah uses the symbol of the potter. He sees a potter at a wheel. The potter is working his clay, and the pot ends up not like the way he wants it at all. So he clumps it all together, wads it up, throws it back on the wheel, and starts all over. And Jeremiah says, that's what God's going to do with this nation. We sometimes sing a song that has the verses, I am the potter, you are the potter, I am the clay. I'm not sure we really understand the implications of that based on Jeremiah, because what Jeremiah is saying is God's the workman here, and you're the workmanship. If he doesn't like the way it's turning out, he can wad it up and start all over. And that's what he's going to do with the nation of Israel, or the nation of Judah at this point in time. Other illustrations that he uses a flask. He breaks a flask, says that's what God's going to do to the nation. At one point, he buries a waistcloth. He goes to Babylon, buries a waistcloth, and then goes back and gets it again to show that God would take his people to Babylon and then bring them back home again. Jeremiah is an interesting character. He has a tough time in his life. He ends up in the stocks one night. He's placed there, comes out spitting fire the next day. It really doesn't tone him down at all. The people get mad at him. They get tired of hearing what he's saying. They throw him in a pit. He's subject to ridicule. In chapter 36, by the way, Jeremiah probably is not in chronological order. In chapter 36, he writes out, dictates to his scribe Baruch, dictates to him probably the words of something like the book of Jeremiah. And that book then is read to the king's servants who take it to the king. The king orders it read in his presence, and as it's being read, the king takes a penknife and cuts off strips of that scroll and throws them into the fire and burns them up. The most blatant disregard for God's word that you're going to find in the Old Testament ever is this king cutting those strips off the book and throwing it into the fire and disregarding what the warnings Jeremiah brings. Well, Jeremiah is not having fun. He apparently did not want this job too much, and he's not enjoying it once he has it. There are several personal laments that Jeremiah expresses throughout the book. The fifth one is at Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 7. And he starts out, "O Yahweh, you have deceived me, and I was deceived. You're stronger than I, you've prevailed. I've become a laughingstock all the day. Everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I cry out, I shout, violence, destruction." In other words, you can't say anything good, everything's bad. "For the word of Yahweh has become for me a reproach and derision all day long." Then listen to this next line. "If I say, I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, there is in my heart as it were a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I am weary with holding it in, and I cannot." He's saying, God, you're not fair. This isn't right. You're making me a laughingstock for this whole nation. I go out there, and every time I open my mouth, I'm telling them, oh, the nation's going to die. It's going to go down to tubes. Babylon's coming in. You're going to go off into captivity. I don't have any good news for him, he says. So I decide, well, I'll just shut up. I won't say anything. And you're not fair because it just burns inside of me, and all of a sudden it's coming out of my mouth again. It's not fair. He does end that lament on a positive note. In verse 11, he says, Yahweh is with me as a dread warrior. Therefore, my persecutors will stumble. In other words, they eventually will fall. They will be greatly shamed. They will not succeed. And down to verse 12, O Yahweh of hosts, who tries the righteous, who sees the heart and the mind, let me see thy vengeance upon them, for to thee have I committed my cause. In other words, I'm your man, but give me a little glimpse of how this all comes about. God does. Jeremiah will watch the fall of the city of Jerusalem. He will be left behind with the poorest and dumbest of the land as Babylon hauls off the brightest and the best. And Jeremiah will watch these poor, dumb people who are left behind assassinate the Babylonian governor, Gedaliah, that's left behind, and then have to go on the lam to Egypt. And Jeremiah goes to Egypt with them. The last we hear of Jeremiah, he is preaching against their worship of the Egyptian gods. So he doesn't change. He maintains that same status of speaking for God on behalf of the people, even when he's in Egypt. There is promise, there is comfort, and there is hope in the book of Jeremiah, as Jeremiah says that God would one day deliver his people from the land of Babylon and bring them back home.